Okay, so I'll, without overthinking this, just kind of give a quick response, I suppose, and it could be open for further discussion or unpacking or what have you. It's kind of this question, a simple approach to this notion that can there be a type of mutuality or coexistence between Christianity and Islam? And I basically said, like, my estimation is that, like, absolutely yes, there can be. And then what tends to usually be the response is, going into the seeming contradictions and things like that. Or Christians will insist that Muslims need to be saved, and Muslims will insist that Christians need to convert, and da-da-da-da-da. I was just going to try to do a quick response, but there's just a lot more that goes into even framing it in that way. Over the years, it just in practice tends to be framed as this forced coercion and, back and forth, as though they're trying to resolve the same type of thing. And there's just so much that is problematic about that. And it requires somebody to go back into Christianity and try to resolve what is even meant by the idea of being saved and whatnot. I tend to think we're kind of approaching a phase where, so I guess from the beginning I'll say I'm not against Christianity or what the core spiritual teachings of it are. I think it contributes to the question of humanity and where we're going as we evolve together as like a shared unit. But I also think some phases that had once maybe been on the precipice of maybe a sense of progress in terms of God among the world. I mean, it depends on who you talk to. But at least any aspect of Christianity that had some level of progress, I think is reaching a point where the previous ideas on the surface level of interpretation just don't suffice. It's getting to the point where, it's beyond the point. The world has gone through a lot of growth pains and entanglements and conflicts on national levels amongst different interpretive approaches to Christianity. Anyway, though, maybe it's not so much as like we're finally to this stage, because we've been needing this stage of things, as much as maybe we're finally to an opportunity to go even farther with interpretation. I'd kind of talked about before, it takes a lot to try to unpack the error in that approach, but also why it's confusing to people. I think it's confusing to people because there is something that functions within Christianity that tends to does tend to contribute to their spiritual practice and whatnot, more so than just utter rejection of it. And so there's some usefulness to it in a spiritual aspect, but eventually it gets to the point where it's not quite interpreted in its intended revelation. And so eventually a lot of people, through progressing into those beliefs through that framework, eventually, if they're honest with themselves, they get to the point where it just no longer seems to work, or there's something about it. And then they start to realize there's some discrepancies in the interpretation and whatnot. So anyway, along those lines, because I've been trying for so long, so many years, to reconcile some of these things, not just because there's something that should be preserved about Christianity. I tend to think there is, but also because it's so harmful on the world stage, eventually the way those types of ideas come into conflict and gridlock with other beliefs and other ideas. But also because I've been on the receiving end historically, even though I am open to Christianity and I see the spirit of its core principles and whatnot, and I want to validate those, I've generally historically been among people groups that are on the negative side of Christianity, but I have done work to try to reconcile those. And so that's just kind of quickly explaining my approach to it. But in doing that and then having to do work on my own to to make sure that I work through myself and my own blind spots and whatnot. Like, I'm not a perfect person, but I do feel like I've gone through years of critiquing myself so that I could see the situation more clearly, or at least be better positioned to do that. I mean, for the rest of our lives, we'll continue to grow. It's the school of life. We're always growing and refining and whatnot, but we can get to a place where we know how to recognize what further growth is. And so eventually then it just becomes like this ongoing interaction of refinement and increasing mutuality among others and da-da-da. Anyway, so in finally getting to being more situated in that type of approach to this, I do have to ask myself, so one of the questions, like the guiding principles that I have is, what would I have wanted other groups to approach like our people as? What, and I have to have that standard for myself. Like, I can't just go into it with like vengeance and balancing the blood account scales, the historical animosity. I have to there are those you have to work through. There is that tension, there is that animosity, but you also have to ask, what is the thing that I would have done different? And so that's a guiding question in the backdrop of my mind when I approach these topics, is like, what would I have wanted to have been done differently? Was there even another option? And so I also take that when I look at scripture, like, what's the other option here besides this horrific tension that we see some of Christianity and some forms of Judaism and these occupying forces take in their interpretation from scripture. So something that along those lines that I try to attribute is I try to validate the spiritual inheritance that I have, and I try to validate the spiritual inheritance in somebody else's practice. So even if we are at this stage where maybe some interpretations have this historical animosity, I still challenge myself to say, how do I prevent myself from reacting to that error? Because I didn't want people reacting to that error in any of our groups of people, and maybe some subsets of groups that behaved with error of interpretation and error in representing our culture as well. And so I ask myself, is this like an error of interpretation? And can I challenge myself to still correct for responding to the spirit and the core of somebody else's spiritual interpretation? Anyway, so from there, what I then tend to challenge myself with when I interpret these things is, what's the core guiding principles of Judaism? What's the core guiding principles of Christianity, of this group, that group, and whatnot? And another guiding kind of document that is helpful along those lines is, if you look at the, like in negotiating among people groups in the world, and I think it's pretty good, is the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights or something to that effect. And it kind of goes into this question of basically like having this approach of cultural respect, as long as it's basically like pertaining to universal human rights. And that's kind of how we can, in some basic sense, discern between, because there are some cultural practices that had developed into actions that people would not deem as, like a part of the inclusive universal human rights pertaining to each individual and the expectation of their life and quality of life and whatnot. That kind of gets us on a side note here. I guess since I brought it up, I kind of want to say a little bit more about that. I know since we're living in a time, I mean, it's always been like this, but it's just more prevalent now, or we're more aware of it constantly because of the social media age, where we could see what people say about the other groups and other cultures. There is a sense where certain cultures eventually within themselves can develop forms of like hostile practice. I just generally don't think, though, that that's ever really organically a part of their core principles. We're human beings, and there's certain portions of our existence. The very fact that we survive past infancy, seeing that a part of survival is like this sort of dependence that we have and vulnerability that we have. And so we are products of this type of core beginnings as human beings that we just don't initially organically develop into like horrific hostile beings. Those happen from other types of interactions that never happens in an isolated sense. So I just kind of want to say that it's not ever, in my estimation, it's not really accurate to say that any culture is like innately hostile and grown from hostility. And I actually think that's biblical. That's a biblical sense that we don't always see in scripture, but that is trying to correct for improperly otherizing other groups. That's one of the things that the scriptures is trying to unravel, is that when groups get to the point of developing hostility, they see through a lens of hostility, and then they identify groups through a lens of pure hostility, and that's never really accurate. Anyway, so I do generally think that when we're approaching mutual negotiations between groups, we're striving to get to the core of their spiritual beginnings, their spiritual selves, unique people groups and whatnot. If it is the argument to say, well, we can't do that because we're not just accepting of everything, we've heard that before, like love the person, hate the sin, whatever is another way of saying like, we love you, but you have all of the rest of you and your culture has to go. And I just think that that's not accurate. So how do we discern between that, right? So that actually, some of these things, these divides between groups, is actually what the scriptures seem to be about. So when people have these questions, so now going back to, can Christianity and Islam like coexist, or not even just coexist, but, actually merge in a sense of spiritual mutuality? And I think, yes, they can. That's the very question that the scriptures is trying to resolve. And the reason why I can say I can identify with the different sides is because it does speak to this kind of like template of these other sides. Like that's the thing that the scriptures are trying to resolve. But humanity and our tendency to create these divides recreates the hostility of interpretation. So that's kind of what I'm saying too, is like there's a need to remedy that. So let's see. It seemed like there was another thing I was going to say. There's always going to be a lot of things to say along these lines of negotiation. But anyway, so then getting back to that point, I did talk a little bit about that. If you wanted to see, well, where's an example of that in scripture? I talked about that in that just like recently, I put the audio out titled Amalek 2, and it kind of carries over from discussions about, like King Saul and Amalek. And basically it kind of gets to the point of revealing that Amalek and the, I think his name is like the Beor, the king of Beor, or something like that, are very similar to what happened. Like they're the othered group, right? They're supposed to be the other side. That's like the, not us, like us and them. But then later, King Saul and his son Jonathan are another version of like the king and Amalek. So then you find like, oh, there is a similarity in how hostility develops. There's a similarity so what we also find in scriptures, like once there's a phase of grown hostility repeats as a similar phase of human development that I'm calling, when I interpret the scripture, that I'm calling the stage of like the system. So hostility isn't just innately grown in individuals or individual groups. The stage of hostility comes into play or becomes enacted as a social interaction, which gets entangled in systems. And so it's a system stage. And so then once we're introduced to the stage, like in the complexities of the storyline, when it reaches the system stage, what the scriptures are starting to help reveal is that whether you're looking at it internally in your group, there's error at system stages once it becomes a stage of hostility, or once you're imposing that identifying standard on another group, it looks the same. The stage of systemic hostility repeats itself throughout and looks the same. And then when it gets to that point, it's hard for groups to look at the core principles of spiritual mutuality, like similar commonplace of joining together amongst other groups. So anyway, along those lines, we can kind of get into that. That's a whole long story about scripture and whatnot, and kingdoms and systems and people groups and conflicts. And then eventually it gets to Jesus, and he's talking about love the other group as you love your group, or see yourself in them. Try to envision that merging of mutuality, and then centering that onto God, which is like the guiding force to keep evolving. Rather than, if we don't have that guiding force of centering on God, we generally tend to become fixated on the other, and then we kind of get skewed in our, whether it be improper hierarchy competing, or because it's not so much that. So I know when people, there's so much to say here if you're talking about systems. When you get to the phase of where you're confronting the problem with hierarchy competing, the tended counter to that would be, well, we can't all just be the same. There's going to be some levels of hierarchy. That's not what I'm saying. There's a difference between being guided in your own personal growth that is guided, and it's like this standard unto your spiritual growth that grows you up. And yes, if you look at it from the outside, people might seem at different levels, but you're not guided by that outward standard. You're guided by your inward standard for your personal growth. And then if you're guided by that inward standard of personal growth, then there's questions on, well, what does that mean? But anyway, we'll just kind of make reference to it. But your standard of growth is just different. This is where we kind of get into, in the whole range of these entangled systems and hostility between groups and what it grows into on these systemic levels and and these improper hierarchy battles. There is this question of what's the distinction of transforming this with this like spiritual process, right? So then you get into like, what is the story saying then? Because it's introducing this template, these parameters of hostilities of systems, cultures, regions, from the earth base all the way to the heights of kingdoms, and then the collapse of kingdoms, and then different sides being on different sides of that like collapse and experiencing it for themselves as they keep playing the game of improper world hierarchy, right? And then it gets into like, what is the mystery that transforms this pattern of error? And why does this pattern of error always look the same no matter what label you put on it? So then what is part of the like spiritual distinction happening in the midst of that? And so that's what part of the story is about as well, like intermixed into all of it. So then people will get into this like, what was Jesus doing then? What was the story of Jesus? So part of it, when you look at it along these lines, is one aspect is that Jesus is, so I have these notes here. Jesus is helping to reveal that we have access to God aligned within ourselves, in our spirit. And then he's also helping to relieve the system kingdom hostility to start introducing system mutuality. He talks about this in like renewing the kingdom. And then another thing along those lines is that then it's important to, from that centering, learn how to be receptive and have a spiritual tuning of receptivity so that we evolve along the flow of our spiritual to collective growth. So those are the things it's resolving. The other likenesses that people attribute to it, where they talk about being saved or all these other things, or the way of life and whatnot, then comes into these different interpretations as to when Jesus is doing that and resolving those points, what gets in the way of that? What becomes difficult on the world stage in order to do that, to find centering on God, to have kingdom mutuality or like systemic mutuality and centering on God so that we're spiritually evolving? What gets in the way of that? So what we find in the story is like some of the things that get in the way of that is people don't know where. So like let's see, one of the symbols introduced into the systems once they've become entangled and they're competing on kingdom system levels, and they just rise and fall and rise and fall, is that the temple then becomes introduced into the systems as a transformative practice. Over time, it takes a while. But even the development of the temple is absorbed from other versions of temples. And so it's absorbed from, so eventually in the entanglement of the systems is also an entanglement of an attempt toward religious practices. And not even just an attempt. Some smaller group, it's just a collection of religious practices and then refining over time and refining over time. So one portion that's transformative in the symbol, or the transformative aspect of the temple, drawing people together, which that's a large part of what Moses was doing. And even at some point, his people wanted to kill him and like do away with it because it was just too much of a difficult thing to do. They wanted to just be a part of the rising kingdoms and whatnot. So even like situating the temple in this other, and there were other groups too, like other priests and other ones that became absorbed into this movement of the temple and whatnot, helping to develop it. And that's why people will say, because, when we look at Christianity or Judaism on the world stage, people tend to absorb these ideas into their tendency for competing. And so I think that's where it gets into, people will say, wait a second, when we really look at what you're talking about, this is like contributions from a lot of other religions and groups too. And I think that's accurate. When you actually look at the story, there's so many contributions. Like Joseph didn't do it on his own. His brothers, some of the people didn't always support him. Some of them did. And he didn't do it on his own without Egypt. Egypt contributed a lot. And then some of the Midianites contributed, some other groups contributed. Like, there really was a lot of contribution from various ones that people, when they try to read it through a lens of either or, they just don't really see that. But if you try to read it through all the contributions, there's tons of contributions and meshing the whole way through. But there's also in the midst of it this refining of simplifying the main points of what it is. And then ultimately, long story short, Jesus then eventually reveals like the temple, like we are the temple, or, he is the temple, the first building blocks, the cornerstone of rebuilding this temple, like all this different symbolism. There's different ways that he makes reference to it. Basically, though, that he, and likened to us being gathered in it, are the temple, and it's revealed that God is actually within us. That centering holy place is actually accessible within us, so then we can live aligned to God, which actually was the main point that was attempting to be revealed in the Garden of Eden. But in that we don't live from that centering place, we tend to just duplicate being outwardly referred on the world stage, and then we get into these competing hostilities and build these competing systems. Anyway, so it's a long story to have that personal centering recognized and kind of more quickened in our lives as we strengthen it, and it becomes more of a guiding receptivity to how we evolve. Along those lines, though, in the symbol of the temple is that there had, among nations warring against each other and reaching these stages of hostility, had become what they call the blood accounts. And so a huge portion of the work of the temple was to help deliberate and create a place to deliberate and negotiate the blood accounts. A guide in how you would make decisions on the world stage, and even, including in reference to the direction of your kingdom. And something that seems to be apparent there, especially in the old ways, is that they felt very much believing that, almost like maybe like karma, that they would not go out in war or conflict without seeking the direction of what it would do on behalf of their kingdom. And so they would kind of go and seek for guidance to the best that they could, or what their spiritual reference was, as to like, would this battle be good for us, or almost put like bad energy on us. And so they would go and they would seek the holy place and kind of get a discernment for, do we have, like in the blood accounts or the historical accounting, are we justified in this battle and whatnot? And so a lot of the story reads like that, because there are times where, because you have to think of it as like the older literature and whatnot, like ancient accounts where, and there actually seems some truth to that, because there is something, how they say like your body or something keeps the score. I've heard reference to that. I haven't looked into like that actual book. But it's just this idea, though, of something within the human makeup would feel like there is kind of like a scorekeeping incorporated in life. And so they would go to these spiritual seekers and they would say, like, are we going to put like negative energy on us if we enact this or that? And da da da. And they'd really believe that, because then there would be times where things would come on them. Like there would be acts that would come on them, or like a felt curse on the people if they made these wrong decisions. So they actually did try to keep somewhat of an accounting on whatever battles they would go out to, or spiritually discern what choices they should make. Eventually then, so that really is a huge part of what the temple is. That's like a huge aspect of a lot of ancient cultures as well, is that people believed that there had to be a proper strategic approach and receptivity to being spiritually guided into battle, whether you had favor on your side or not. Eventually, when they're starting to develop the temple, they kind of get this other like guidance and revelation that it says like basically something to the effect of, and I could look it up, but it's something to the effect of like when you go into lands, don't pollute the land with bloodshed, because you can't atone for it or remedy it or fix it or be freed from inappropriate bloodshed without the shedding of your own blood. And so if you do this, if you start polluting the land with bloodshed, like it basically you will pollute the land. The land will become difficult to inhabit. So there then just becomes this increased recognition of keeping proper blood accounts, transitioning from, because there had been pasts where different ones would go out and they would just make decisions on their own, which would affect their whole community and whatnot. So it's kind of getting into more of a like collective cohesiveness. Anyway, so along those lines, that's a huge portion of what then becomes this idea of later what people interpret as like being saved through Jesus and being atoned for and all of these things. And so, and I'm really simplifying it here, but eventually there becomes this tension where the kingdoms grow in heights and power, but they can never really, it's almost like this cloak of all the blood accounts, just they're encapsulated in. And so they can never really be free from like the accumulation of requirements of the temple, which accumulates more and more and more because the complexities of human behavior within these grown systems and kingdoms just become more complex. And so it develops into this morphed temple establishment and all these requirements, but there's still a level where it's not really transformed. It's just holding place and keeping things in gridlock. And accompanying that is still these like collections of kingdoms. And so you have all these examples of like the kingdoms grow to the heights and then they can't really be transformed internally. And so they just like erode and then they build and erode and they build and erode. So basically then what we kind of get is that there's never really a freedom from world kingdoms trying to build themselves up and be free from these blood accounts. Even though they have the temple morphing to all these requirements, it just grows into this massive like management of blood accounts and historical animosity and powering over people and accumulated requirements of the temple and da-da-da-da. So eventually what we start to understand at some basic level with what Jesus is talking about in terms of these blood accounts and the transformation of the kingdom and reduction of the increased requirements that morphed even beyond the core nucleus of the temple and it was actually like the tent of meeting, turned into this huge establishment of these things and world markets and all of this stuff and historical animosities and competing to be in the temple establishment or competing to be in the kingdom role or da-da-da-da. So something that we actually get with Jesus is that he starts to reveal and portray how we solve for the basic distinctions of the temple, our access to God, and then working out our personal centering so that we can become part of like de-escalating and minimizing all of the accumulation of the kingdom, the temple, and our felt requirements for God. So those are the things that it becomes this revelation of what we are then relieved from through. So like if you look at one of the things morphing that is the blood accounts. And so Jesus helps to reveal how we gain more freedom toward the revelation and guidance of God within ourselves, as opposed to what becomes a sense of a world power, is that people can't really break out of the historical blood accounts because we're all trapped in these kingdoms and systems, that then we become susceptible in a sense to like whatever kingdom is trying to like overpower and manage the powers at the time. At the time when this became a major gridlock, there's a lot that goes into this interpretive aspect of the blood accounts and whatnot. But I guess to attempt to simplify, at the time, there's this growing gridlock between the world kingdom powers and the temple, which was a place that would help manage, in a sense, like manage the blood accounts. And in a strange way, like I talked about in some of my other audio recordings where I was saying, eventually what God kind of does in the story is he gives a version of the in-group, like the in-group and the internal happenings of what is occurring when a power structure becomes gridlocked. And it goes all the way back into comparison. So once it reaches that stage of this gridlock between the temple, the blood accounts, and the world kingdom power, it then likens it to being able to look at how this grown power was developed way back when Abraham was called to help alleviate it in a spiritual transformation, which was called the God Most High. And the God Most High in the order of Melchizedek is way back when in Genesis, where they was portrayed as a similar gridlock of kings and managing, and a king priest managing the temple and the accounting of plunder and historical acts and whatnot. And so it kind of helps us to understand this whole huge revelation of how did it get to that point where it comes across as this group that is really trying to manage, or has this imagery of managing acts on behalf of this attempt to center on God, these various practices in reference to the kingdoms. And then what we find, though, is eventually one of the ways that they're trying to manage this gridlock of kingdom, blood account, temple access is they have to eventually they can't transform it. And so they keep having to manage warfare and conflict, and then that pays tribute unto their system, and then their priests try to navigate and manage it as unto blessing and cursing unto God. So it's this whole long story, right? So then we eventually get the reoccurrence of that at the time of Jesus. And it's this long story to see what was going on internally that created that gridlock of that power system. So we get this other example. And what we find is that, okay, it is doing the similar thing. It's this these priests that become merged with the kings, and they're managing the temple in reference in a likeness unto God. intending to try to manage the accounts of God, and they are in connection to the world kings. The world kings then are they manage the world populations. And if you read the accounts of what they say, whether it be under Nebuchadnezzar, whether it be under Persia, they say they kind of say what the decree of the kings is that they, anyone that is a felt threat to them, they manage the felt threats from a kingdom power rule. And if there is a felt threat, then they enact conquering and occupation and plunder. And then that tribute then gets paid into what keeps the kingdom going. And then that also coincides with the temple management and also trying to negotiate between historical management of the accounts of nations through the temple. And also in an attempt to be in line with the direction of where God is going. So eventually, though, it just gets so gridlocked once again. But we're seeing it now. And so then this is where Jesus comes on the scene and is introducing this, okay, now that we're here again on the world stage, what's transformative about this stage? Because it's not really free. And so at this point, Jesus comes in and confronts this sense of this kingdom, temple, blood accounts, management, and tribute and plunder. And on some simple note, what he does help to reveal is that he confronts the aspects of gridlock that have caused this to kind of be morphed into this interconnected relationship. And so he confronts the decree of the kings about their overpowered management over nations, and he introduces a different way for mutuality to be developed among nations. And he confronts the money system, of which is paying into both the temple management and the world kings and through world plunder. And then he helps to portray how different forms of money through the temple were supposed to be transformative in increasing, a connection among the people and spiritual guidance and alleviating the tensions among kingdoms. And eventually, through a lot of different teachings, he reveals, as I was saying, that we have access to God in the center of our being, and that spiritual connection. And so then we don't have to feel compelled to have to adhere to what had become a corrupt temple authority. And then through that, their management of kingdom, national plunder on the world kingdom stage. And so Jesus just really transforms a lot of those things. And then that's where we get into where we realize we have an ability for personal alignment in our spirit to God, and the ability to work out connection among other groups outside of our personal group, and we can seek out forms of mutuality. So all of these things, this is a very simplified approach to it, but all of these things then have this result of diminishing kingdom hostility, diminishing the economy of world plunder, and then switching it around to where the idea of a temple, which then becomes revealed as this societal knitting together of humanity, is a transformed way to live upon the earth with each other and in this new renewed kingdom system. And so that's a lot of what Jesus is about. Some of what comes into mind with the idea when people say, well, what about though, the blood, the blood accounts, like Jesus dying and what seems to be kind of like a spiritual magic there. What about that part? Because we could see the reorganizing of a better system and whatnot. And so I guess, another simple approach to it is, if you recall in the past through the stories, the blood accounts people felt was an animated curse upon people that they couldn't escape. And so if you do want to look at it in the sense of the actual spiritual, almost the magic version of it, is the question is what helps people to feel confident that sense of that curse is taken off of them, I guess you could say. And then the evidence of that being shown, that they are free to work out like a just system and spiritual mutuality and spiritual responsiveness. So some of that is you have to ask, like, how does Jesus resolve what was said in Numbers, where it says, like, don't go in and pollute the land with bloodshed, or else those who shed the blood will have to, the only way to alleviate blood is that the person that shed the blood must pay that atonement for the blood. And so then you have to ask, how did Jesus do that? How did Jesus pay for that, the blood accounts, pay off the blood accounts, so that this curse is not lingering over humanity, so we have the freedom to work out systemic and personal spiritual mutuality? And some of that is in that over time, part of the temple, which there was always similar temples, but what was different about portions of what was happening with this, like the sect of Moses, because he was building and fashioning it in the similar vein of like other traditions. And he had even, I talked about that before, like he had even been mentored by other groups that had these similar approaches to the temple and spirituality. But one of the spiritual distinctions within the temple was that the temple was, or let's see, how do I simplify this to, first, Israel was dedicated to God as, like in the old way, like a symbol of the firstborn, a firstborn given to God. In the old ways, a lot of the connotation of a like firstborn given to God has some kind of connotation that that offspring would be an inheritance of their kingdom. So there's this symbolism. It gets complicated, but there's a symbolism where Israel, this is prior to the development of the temple, Israel is dedicated to God as then being in the inheritance, or like this like mutuality with God in the domain of God. Eventually then, when the temple is introduced in the midst of Israel, then the temple portions include allotments of land, and then there's this other little set aside portion of one of the tribes that is given to the inheritance of the temple. And this tribe set aside that is it doesn't get a land allotment. Its inheritance is the temple, or it is set aside for the work of the temple. Its inheritance is God, and so it is given the inheritance of God as placed in the dominion of God of sorts. So through these symbolisms, as the movement grows, portions of the land, it's almost like this, what would be a good comparison? This practice where on the side of Israel that has the land inheritance, it absorbs and connects with other land practices and interactions. But then it's not just ultimately in a closed system of just land compared to land. So it's not just a system of like blood accounts on the land compared to blood accounts on the land. There's this other little transformative portion where one of the groups does not get a land inheritance, and it goes into the inheritance of God set aside in the temple, as people set aside as like this inheritance of God. Through the practices in the temple are these transformative practices where if they be in error or need atonement, then it is given unto this like absorbing atonement within the practices of the temple attributed to God. So over time, as there's error, part of that accounting then gets interwoven and intertwined into the accounting that's given over to the dominion of God, which it's taking what would already happen on the world stage. Like I had said, this had happened before, but the little distinction is that a portion, it's not just land for land as a closed system. There's this one little transformative portion where over time the interactions are being collected into this temple interaction. So there's another component in this interaction that eventually will be the transformative piece of it. So eventually then, this is where when Jesus kind of enters into this as well, and other people are absorbed into it, and after it goes through this whole collection, and even on the world stage, the kingdom powers then come in and occupy Israel. Along with occupying Israel, they occupy the temple. Then they put their accounting into like the shared accounting, which also is incorporated with the accounting of the temple. Over time, then there's this like whole symbolism of all of the accounting is susceptible to every piece that has a part of it. So at this point, you could say, all right, well, it seems similar to where now the accounting, the blood accounts are full, but now they're full in relation to the temple, this redevelopment of this temple. And these are like dedicated to like in the like partially in the dominion of God and whatnot. And then remember, like the word said, like nobody could account for blood except those that spilt the blood. Eventually then, through other types of like interpretive practices and other types of symbolism and other types of integration, then we get this reveal that Jesus portrays like that he is the temple. And so it could be suspected, there's a lot more interpretive work that needs to go in here. But as he's saying, now he's like encompassed in this becoming the temple and whatnot. People might say, well, how does he do that? How does that interpretively follow to where he can claim to say that? You could see after the fact that it makes sense to say this huge reveal that God is within us in our spirit. And if we had functioned through these mechanisms of our own personal centering to our social, interactions and systemic mutuality, things would have been alleviated. We could see that far. But that space between of like, well, how does it interpretively follow, though, to where Jesus becomes like the temple? But anyway, just to keep it simple, Jesus then proclaims like through all these revelations that like he is the temple. Basically then a place where he can become like integrated into the holding place of these partial blood accounts in between the kingdom world and the temple and such and such. Then there's this long story about this intersection between like the kingdom authority and the temple authority. And like they enact this like conviction on him. He's condemned by these systems to suffer the punishment of the systems. Through his death then seems to coincide with this sense of this spiritual breakthrough from the animation of the blood accounts absorbed within the kingdom and the temple power, establishment power at that time. And Jesus then, to some degree, then, like I said, there's a lot of interpretive stuff that needs to go with each section of this. Then Jesus breaks out of the perpetual accumulated animation and the felt constant curse over people of the curse of the blood accounts, which then frees them from the felt compliance to these the world dominion and the at the time accumulated establishment dominion over the temple, and then allows for people. It's not so much just like that everything is magically then put into its proper place, as much as it through the story seems to kind of have this sense of portraying a breaking of the felt curse that would keep people in this like fearful animation, unable to make proper negotiations, unable to seem free from the establishment and whatnot in order to work out their spiritual like edification and like liberation, and stuff like that. And so when you think about it in those terms, then you realize some of the things that Jesus did was to free people to find their personal spiritual centering. And then the attributes of that would be to work out like systemic mutuality, and in that then rebuilding a different type of kingdom freed unto God, of which then continues as people become even more spiritually receptive within themselves, and then become connected and interwoven with other people through that spiritual receptivity. It's interesting to think about this in terms of, like there's a lot of little details to work out here. People might think, I don't know if that's how the story reads, but I do think that you could see it there. Like you could see it through some of the symbolism. But then if you're thinking about it like that, and you're thinking, what is it that Jesus is saving then? Like, what was this about? And he's enabling people to be able to be free to work out, like their spiritual mutuality with other human beings, and seeing the ability to be free to de-escalate kingdom hostilities and to transform approaches to kingdoms that is not in the imagery of the dominant kingdoms of plunder and occupying and hostility and demonizing, and stuff like that. And so along those lines, then it's very much given the ability to look at other nations and to think, how do we de-escalate those hostilities? How do we see that similar approach of de-escalating and formulating mutuality? And then, so back to the question, this is a long way around this question, but in terms of like Islam, at some level, you could say that at the time when Islam was developed, there were still hostilities on a kingdom level within Judaism, Christianity, and other nations and groups. There were some groups working out their spiritual freedoms and some of these things that Jesus gave the example for, but there were still these tensions of warring nations and kind of like a power over other groups, still practicing these approaches to world dominion and the very things that Jesus was trying to transform. So in the midst of that, though, you also get this spiritual birthing of this movement of Muhammad in the spirit of seeking a language within his cultural group to put words to, and there's even this like admitting that they had drawn from some portions of Christianity, some portions of Judaism that was influential. But at the time, when you're in the midst of you can both concur that there's something to some of these other teachings, but if it's not really portraying itself in the freedom of its testimony, you can't expect other groups to draw to it the expectation that it's a practice for freedom when it's not delivered to them through a practice of freedom. So he has this spiritual movement where it stirs upon him this desire for increasing spiritual freedom within his cultural framework with similar attributes that Jesus was seeking for. And he draws to himself some versions of Christianity and Judaism and whatnot. And at the time when initially he's not even at odds with Christianity and Judaism as much as in his own cultural group, he's seeking spiritual freedom in the midst of what had become another form of like a gridlocked interaction of like hostilities and economic pressures in relation to religious worship. And so those are the very things he's seeking to transform. I don't look at it as he's competing with Christianity as trying to reintroduce the temple system in the way that Jesus had done through Moses and whatnot for a transformative work of revelation of having spiritual access into yourself. He's at the stage where he's already accepting and recognizing the ability for spiritual access unto himself, because the movement of Islam is after Judaism and Christianity, and it shows evidence of what Jesus talked about, that people have the freedom to experience a spiritual, kind of like the incoming of a spiritual revelation as they enact a type of temple and residence and ability for connection to God. And that's what happens. He becomes a product of a person that has a spiritual revelation after Jesus reveals that this is attainable, this is like available for humans to have, which also happens to Paul the Apostle. Paul the Apostle was an enemy of Christianity, and then he has an incoming spiritual experience that starts to transform him, and the attributes of that evidenced on the world stage is that he starts to speak unto mutuality and freedom and alleviating burden and transforming the kingdoms. Initially, that's, also what Muhammad had, was the spiritual incoming of an experience through the centering of his life, which then has the attributes of seeking economic and freedom from various dominions. And so I just don't see it as starting as some type of competition against Christianity or Judaism. And it's not even seeking to compete with or answer those same questions. Islam is a product of what Jesus revealed should be attainable, as seen surfacing through nations of the world as attributes and cultural locations of this surfacing of the attributes of the movement of Jesus, which is spiritual receptivity, without having to have been in a temple, economic freedoms and types of seeking justice so that economic hardships are not a power unto dominating systems, and then being relieved from those dominating systems. Similar, though, to every other spiritual movement on the world stage, when the world stage is not yet transformed, eventually come into contact with these systems and unresolved systems. And then any kind of spiritual movement ends up having to compete on the world stage against these transformed hostile systems. And then that's when they become different versions of what they originally were. And then they become on the world stage caught up in these animosities and the hostility stage of the merging of world systems. But if you really look at the core ideas in the spiritual movement, it does seem to be there. So if we're looking at the world stage now, people can say, well, some of the stuff we'd like to see remedied in competing cultures is the stages of hostility and whatnot. And it's like, well, that's kind of what this is about. But other groups need to recognize that their forms of power over other groups generate, though the stage of hostility is generated among stages of hostility of systems. And so it's like a group effort to look at what is it to minimize those stages, and then what is it to look at the core spiritual beginnings of different cultural contributions, and then what does that look like. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now. A lot of things to kind of check notes on and whatnot. But that's kind of, I'd say, my quick answer, but this is like an hour, but quick in terms of how detailed the stories actually are and how complex it really gets. But anyway, that's an overview.